Okay, then. So, generally speaking, a game comes in for review. You review the game. We're typically given like a week to review the game. And, that's okay. Could do with more time. Until Dawn, the remaster, has arrived on PlayStation 5 and PC. And this one is somewhat different in that the game arrived 24 hours before the launch day. Typically, that sends out the message that the game isn't particularly great because, whoever supplies that review code seemingly doesn't want reviews ready for launch.
Right.
Now, Oliver, you've taken a look at the PlayStation 5 version of Until Dawn. You've stacked it up against the PlayStation 4 version
Yes.
running under back compat on PlayStation 5. And let's just say that things are a bit problematic, right?
Yes, let me start with the good stuff. Let me start with the good stuff, to be fair to them. Because there is some good stuff here. So the first surprise to me is that the game has basically been completely redone, or largely redone, more or less. Especially with different scenes in the opening of the game. The first 20 minutes plays out very, very differently. It's expanded quite a bit. It has totally different cinematic direction across all the scenes. You take control of the characters at different times. The gameplay is tweaked. So like in the 2015 version, there are like these long, uninteractive QTE sequences, very David Cage-esque, I'd say, that now you actually play through. You can actually propel a character through the environment and actually, get some modicum of gameplay there. And the camera, they've changed the camera system in the game from this kind of like loosely tracked camera and also Resident Evil style camera system from that first game that focused on fixed and kind of these semi-fixed camera angles to a regular third-person right-stick camera, which is perfectly fine. It actually feels pretty good, I'd say, on the controller for the most part, but the character movement is still a little bit sluggish, so you don't get that kind of like tight responsiveness that I think you kind of tend to want when you have full camera control over a character, like that really snappy movement. But of course, this is a slower paced game, and it's kind of like, a little bit awkward, but it doesn't feel too bad. It's pretty all right there. And there have also been some gameplay changes. Like I only played like the first 30, 40 minutes of the game, but there are some mini games that are definitely better implemented here. Like there's a little shooting mini game, and the camera direction and the control and how that scene plays out, it's more natural in PS5 in the new version. In terms of the visual evolution from the first game, I think it actually looks a lot better in the kind of core visuals of the game in that respect. The character rendering has taken a pretty huge step forward in terms of a detail level, in terms of the fidelity of skin rendering. The first game looked pretty great for its time, looking back, but it was an early PS4 title. Does not distinguish itself too amazingly today, I would say. The one exception to that, I think, that still holds up really well is these kind of interstitial scenes with Peter Stormare giving you this really rousing performance, where you get the sense they really went all out with the technology. And I can imagine, probably based on what I'm seeing there, maybe they had a different process for the facial capture, because those scenes are more limited in scope, and the facial rendering is like really, really nice in that content. And here it looks a lot better there, but you tend to see like, okay, they're drawing very heavily from this original content, and they're basically displaying that with higher fidelity assets there. The environments also seem to have been totally remodeled. There's nice little touches like the formable tessellated snow, I think. And the lighting in the remake is often very different. You get much grayer shadows, very different color tone. It's going for something a little bit less stark. That original game, it's very contrasty. You get a very dark, deep black presentation. You get very bright highlights, and it has a cool color tone. In this title, it's more of a warm color tone, and they're going for more of that kind of like gradated look with grayer blacks. Tech-wise, it is kind of interesting. I think there are some things you can rule out pretty easily. It is Unreal Engine 5 here. It's not using a lot of those headline features, so I did not spot a good reflections fallback for Lumen. I don't think they're using Lumen reflections. VSMs are pretty plainly absent. There are some high-resolution shadows, but they're very clear shadow cascades. I don't think the game is using Lumen GI, or if it is, it's not very good, because I wasn't seeing a lot of a great showing for indirect lighting here. There was a lot of places where the indirect lighting, like underneath this bridge overpass here, where the indirect lighting is just kind of failing, where you're getting like this really dark lighting presentation where you should be getting a little bit more of that visible kind of bounce through the scene. And there's no like Lumen GI noise. But okay, so that's the first part of it, which is basically talking about the underlying visuals. Now let's move on to some of the technical problems. So the pre-rendered cutscenes appear to play back with very severe frame pacing or frame ordering issues. Now, most of the cutscenes are real-time, but there are a few of the pre-rendered cutscenes where they're kind of going through an environment a little bit more quickly, showing you a little bit more varied content, and it just looks absolutely horrendous. It just looks horrible. The game has some of the ugliest film grain I've ever seen. It's updating at like 10 to 15 hertz. And it has these awful patterns that look so coarse. It's just an absolute eyesore. It's enabled by default. It looks horrible. And it has kind of different brightness across the frame, sort of, and it has this kind of weird pattern to it. So it's super distracting. It does not look like film that you'd get out of like a scan from a film camera. It does not look like that at all. You know, I usually play with film grain on unless I'm playing for capture purposes, but this look pretty horrible. Image quality is also not great, I would say, but actually the internal res, when I counted it out, it's like 1440p-ish, 1728p-ish. It's coming out at pretty good numbers there. But there's so much aliasing in the image, especially on the fur and the hair and just on high contrast edges in general. It's not great. And the image is kind of breaking up every time there's motion on screen. It does not look great. There are also big performance issues in the 3D content. So not just the pre-rendered content, but the 3D content. This took the form of pretty horrible frame pacing issues in some of the content that I looked at, that I did actually performance analysis on. It could be the case that it gets a little bit worse later on in the game. I only really captured a small portion of it for this analysis, but I was feeling those inconsistencies all over the place. And this has no performance mode either. It's just 30 FPS. So that's kind of the list of initial issues and kind of the initial list of strengths that I saw in the footage, but I'd be curious to hear what you guys think about this one, because it's certainly an interesting game, and the fact that we were sampled it so late, I kind of suspect there's probably a reason for that we're seeing here.
I'm curious what you make of this, Alex. I'm just sort of a bit baffled as to why this thing exists in the first place.
Yeah, it's totally weird. I mean, especially because you're transplanting all this work to a different engine, apparently. It seems like so much time. And nowadays, I doubt you're going to be reusing the initial assets if you were making a sequel, because you would want to rescan in all these characters and people and actors and actresses if they were to show up in the sequel again, with the modern technology that you're not, fixing someone's mistakes from back then at like low res. So I find it extremely strange. I do find the also lack of advertisement, and it's strange. There's a lot of that strangeness here, but I think Alvaro points at a really big failing. I think if you're going to have a 30 FPS cap in a title that is basically a movie in a lot of ways, you have to do it right. And it not being right here to me is just a really big failing, because I think everyone's eyes can see this. I just don't know if they can put their finger on it and point at the technical reason for it. And as a result of that, I think I would not recommend, like, if a game has, especially on PS5, where you cannot save it with VRR at 30 hertz per default, I don't think that's great. And I have yet to look at the PC version. I would imagine, since it's Unreal, it probably has other failings, but I haven't seen it. So I can't really comment. But at the moment, I would say PS5 seems pretty weird, bad place to be in, actually.
Yeah, 30 FPS. I mean, if you're only going to have one singular performance mode and it's 30 FPS, then surely get your 30 FPS frame pacing done correctly. It's not difficult. Sony has system modes to do it, system libraries that just do the job for you. So it is just a touch bizarre. Also bizarre, of course, is the fact that you can run the original PlayStation 4 game on PlayStation 5 and it's kind of 50 to 60 FPS region, which is essentially what you looked at as well, Oliver.
Yes, I mean, that original game, a lot of content, it does run at 60 FPS. It is 1080p 60 there because it never got a PS4 Pro enhancement. It was released in 2015, obviously, so it did not get that support by default, basically. But yeah, I think it's kind of interesting because you go back to that game and it does look pretty good still. I think there are some issues that could probably be cleaned up pretty easily. Like there's a lot of shadow aliasing, right? But of course, increased shadow resolution, shadow map resolution, that goes away. You could certainly improve like level of detail scaling, maybe play with the lighting a little bit. I don't know. I mean, maybe that's outside of scope, but it could be within scope. Maybe work on that, sell it for $20 or $30. Seems reasonable. Get it like 1440p 60, 4K 30. That seems like not too difficult. It's running on Decima, obviously. I don't think you probably port it to a new version of Decima, but I don't think it'd be that hard to get running on PS5 in a decent form. Indeed, it's already running on PS5 in a decent form in this backwards compatible version, but just bumping up a couple of those settings would probably do it. And I'm just kind of befuddled because, like, you look at these Sony remakes or remasters, as they call it, with the Horizon title, but that's kind of a little bit of a remake in its own terms, of these last-gen games, which is sort of weird. Like, what's this fascination with taking games that already look good and run pretty well on current generation hardware and remastering them or remaking them in a situation where maybe a lighter touch would be appropriate, or even with some titles, like, you don't really need to do too much to them, like The Last of Us Part 2, which got a remastered version on PS5 that was already running pretty great with the PS4 code on PS5, and the PS5 code did not see too many improvements. Likewise with Ghost of Tsushima, right? Some titles like that. And now we have Horizon, and now this, and then we also had The Last of Us Part 1, which was maybe a somewhat more worthwhile remastering effort, remaking effort, but still, that was like a little bit out of left field as well. So I do wonder about this. Like, clearly there is a lot of effort that's gone into this title, clearly a lot of time, a lot of money, I'm sure. It does look pretty good relative to the original in a lot of respects, like that underlying artwork, the underlying lighting. I think it is a stronger effort in all those areas. I think it does compare favorably. But it's like these weird technical issues that are failing it. The weird, like the poor anti-aliasing quality, the poor frame pacing, the miserable pre-rendered cutscenes, like that's just not shippable and remotely. It just looks absolutely horrible. I mean, I thought my TV was broken, sort of. It was that bad. And yeah, that original game could use some touch-ups for sure. But like, you think about the time investment that would be required to bring that original game up to kind of a little bit more contemporary standards, maybe bump a couple things up, maybe even remodel the characters. I don't know. You could probably go pretty all out with it and still end up with a lower budget than this, right? So
on like the same tech base, right? It's so weird to transplant the engine. I have no idea what that's about.
I just get the idea that maybe, just maybe, the bean counters have actually figured out that these projects are worthwhile. And then you have the option of possibly thinking, well, if we actually get good sales results from this, maybe there is a route forward with a sequel. And I'd imagine in terms of the core work that the developers have in making the remaster, there's going to be a huge amount of material available that can be suitably embellished, probably at a much lower budget level than doing something new. I think that's pretty much the only reason why this would happen. But it does seem to be a particularly weird thing that's only really happening this generation. And it's kind of odd, isn't it? Oliver, do you think that it looks as though there's a solid foundation here at least, but just a lot of technical issues that should have been caught much earlier in development, right? I mean, stuff like the FMV playback, that's a bug. It should be fixed. The frame pacing issue, that can be fixed. They could get Illusion in to do it if they wanted to, but it is just using the Sony system library, unless there's some reason why that isn't viable for some reason. But we have historically seen issues with Unreal and 30 FPS caps, and some of the other issues that you've talked about. They don't seem to be remarkably difficult to achieve, to fix, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, like, the underlying work they've done here in terms of improving that visual presentation, improving the character models, even like reworking the whole first 20 minutes of the game to have totally different pacing, new cutscene sequences, like they really redid it from scratch there. And from what I understand, there are like lots of changes deeper into the game, possibly, like with, I've heard stuff about new endings and possibly indeed teeing up that sequel that you suggested, Rich, they might be working on there. And I know that this is one of those kind of famous Sony Interactive Entertainment like multimedia projects now, where they have like a film in the works. They have original game. They have, it's the whole shebang here. So you kind of expect like this could be the first part of a bit of a salvo of projects. But in that case, I do think you kind of want this to be a little bit more polished than what they've achieved so far. And I certainly hope they can bring it up that level of polish. But it's just unfortunate because, like, especially with a remastering effort or a remake effort, you kind of expect it to be a little bit easier to kind of nail some of those elements and have it working pretty well out of the gate. Again, with performance improvements, maybe even over that original code, ideally. But obviously that's not the case here. So, yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of the underlying work is very, very strong work, but also there are some like weird issues around the edges that could probably be cleaned up. But well, I guess we'll have to see on that one.
I guess it is worth saying that the only reason you can play that 60 FPS experience on PS5 is because the original was running unlocked. And if we look back to that actual original release, it actually ran shockingly poorly.
Yeah, it's like in the 20s, wasn't it? Pretty often.
It wasn't great. Yeah. So, that's basically, just the brute force power of backwards compatibility that's producing these comparisons here. I think it's got to be patched. They need to take a good hard look at all of the issues being raised here and just get it into shape. I just don't quite understand how it's shipped like that. Those cinematics and the playback there is unbelievable. It's like, who saw that? Who didn't see that? It's just baffling.